Money, my language, and success my entire identity. I was the CEO people whispered about, the one whose name alone opened doors, and whose decisions could shape entire markets. I lived in glass towers, moved through boardrooms where no one dared to interrupt me, and I carried myself with the kind of distance that only comes when you've convinced yourself you don't need anyone. Warmth was weakness. Vulnerability was failure. I had spent years perfecting the art of control, until one night all of it cracked in the most humiliating way possible, on the side of a dark, rain-soaked road, with my broken car and no one to help me. It had been a long day, even by my standards. A dinner meeting with foreign investors had run late, the kind of meeting where every word was a negotiation, every gesture a silent test of dominance. I left with contracts signed, but my body felt heavy with exhaustion. The night sky was painted in shades of gray, the rain falling steadily against the windshield of my luxury sedan as my driver navigated me home. It should have been routine. It should have been predictable. But as fate often does, it waited for the moment when I felt most secure to remind me that even empires can falter. The car shuddered once, then again, before rolling to a reluctant stop on the empty road just outside the city center. My driver frowned, tried the ignition, and then tried again, but the engine refused to respond. I felt irritation rise like fire in my chest. My car, a symbol of perfection, status, and control, had betrayed me. The irony wasn't lost on me. The CEO who could command an empire was suddenly powerless against a stalled engine. We stepped out beneath the drizzle. My driver muttered apologies, fumbling with his phone to call for roadside assistance. I stood beside the gleaming machine that had once felt like an extension of me, now reduced to an expensive piece of useless metal. The street was quiet, the kind of eerie silence that magnifies humiliation. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights casting brief, judgmental glances before vanishing into the distance. I imagined what people would say if they recognized me. Look at her, the woman who rules everything, stranded like the rest of us. Minutes stretched into an eternity. My assistant wasn't answering calls. The company's emergency car service claimed it would take at least an hour. An hour! 60 endless minutes of standing helplessly in the rain, my hair dampening, my heels sinking slightly into the softening asphalt. I hated the feeling. I hated the vulnerability. For someone like me, image was everything, and in that moment I looked less like a titan of industry and more like a lost woman waiting for rescue. And then, as if from nowhere, I heard footsteps. A boy emerged from the dim glow of a street lamp further, down the road. He couldn't have been older than 16, maybe 17. His clothes were simple, worn at the edges, and his shoes carried the weary look of someone who had walked too many miles in them. But his eyes, dark, steady, curious, met mine without hesitation. In his hand, he carried a small tool bag that looked almost as old as he was. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice calm, steady, almost casual. I stared at him, caught off guard. This wasn't the mechanic I had been waiting for, not the polished professional in uniform, not someone sent by a service I paid for. He was just a boy. My pride flared immediately. "It's under control," I replied, though the words tasted false. He didn't argue. He only glanced at the hood of the car, then at me, and something in his expression was almost patient, as though he had seen this kind of problem before, as though he had fixed it 100 times. "If you'd like," he said after a pause, "I can take a look." I hesitated. Everything in me resisted. I didn't want to accept help from a stranger, least of all a boy who looked like the son of a laborer. Yet something in the steady way he stood there, unbothered by the rain or the weight of my authority, disarmed me. Reluctantly, I nodded. Within minutes, he was working with quiet efficiency. He didn't ask questions, didn't waste words. He moved with the kind of focus I associated with boardroom strategists, except his battlefield was the engine of my car. My driver hovered nervously, unsure whether to intervene, but the boy needed no guidance. His hands, though young, carried the confidence of someone who had learned through necessity, not training manuals. I watched, arms crossed, rain sliding down my coat, as this stranger dismantled my humiliation piece by piece. And then, almost too quickly, the engine roared back to life. The sound was jarring, unexpected, a reminder that sometimes solutions don't come from the people you expect them to. I blinked, stunned. My driver exhaled in relief. The boy wiped his hands on his jeans, then closed the hood with a firm push. "There you go," he said simply, as though he hadn't just salvaged the evening of a woman who had built her entire life on the illusion of control. I reached for my purse immediately. "How much?" I asked, pulling out bills without even counting them. Money was my default language, the way I measured gratitude, respect, and obligation. To me, generosity was currency, but he shook his head. "No need." I frowned, certain I had misheard. "Don't be ridiculous. You've helped me. Take it." He stepped back, his gaze steady, his voice firmer this time. "I don't help for money." The words struck me harder than I expected. No one said no to me. Not clients, not competitors, not even family. And yet here was a boy, standing in the rain, refusing something most people would have grabbed with both hands. I had built my life on the belief that everything had a price. But in that moment, for the first time, I realized not everyone could be bought. I was a woman used to buying everything, so why couldn't I buy him? The boy's words hung in the air like a challenge, soft yet immovable, and for the first time in years, I found myself at a loss. I stood there on the slick pavement, the rain still falling in quiet sheets around us, clutching the bills in my hand as though they were not just payment, but proof of my identity. For my entire adult life, money had been the bridge I built between myself and others, the language that translated gratitude, loyalty, even affection. To offer money was to seal a transaction, to close a moment neatly, to ensure that nothing was left uncertain. But this boy with worn shoes and a tool bag older than he was, had rejected it. I felt irritation flare, sharp and unfamiliar. "Don't be foolish," I said, extending the cash again, as if he simply hadn't understood. "You've earned this. Take it." His expression didn't change. Calm, steady, almost detached. "I told you," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I don't help for money." The words unsettled me. I tried again, raising the stakes. If money wasn't enough, then surely something else would be. "Fine," I said, slipping the bills back into my purse. "What do you want, then? A job? A scholarship? I could put you in touch with people who could change your life." My voice carried the confidence of someone used to opening doors, with a phone call, with a signature, with a name. In my world, opportunities were worth more than currency. But he only shook his head. "I don't need any of that." I stared at him, searching his face for some crack in the facade, some hint of hesitation. No one said no to me. Not when I held the kind of influence I did. And yet his expression was unyielding, not arrogant, not defiant, simply resolute. He wasn't refusing me to make a point. He was refusing because in his world, kindness didn't require repayment. My driver shifted uncomfortably beside me, watching the exchange with wide eyes, as though the natural order of things had been disrupted. Perhaps it had. In all my years as a leader, I had never encountered someone so utterly unmoved by what I had to offer. I tried once more, this time softening my tone, almost pleading without meaning to. "Listen, you don't understand who I am. I'm not someone you can just walk away from. If you let me help you, I can make sure you never have to struggle again. Do you hear me?" "Never." The boy's eyes flickered briefly, not with greed, not even with curiosity, but with something that looked like pity. I'm not struggling, he said quietly. I'm living. There's a difference. The words struck deeper than I wanted to admit. I opened my mouth to argue, to explain that life was about more than surviving, that success could be measured in numbers and possessions and recognition. But the look on his face silenced me. He wasn't interested in my world, in my definitions. He had his own. He stepped back, lifting the strap of his tool bag over his shoulder. You don't owe me anything, he said. I just wanted to help. And with that, he turned, walking away into the rain, as though the encounter had meant nothing to him, as though he hadn't just dismantled the very foundation of how I interacted with the world. I stood frozen, the hum of the newly repaired engine filling the silence, the raindrops sliding cold against my skin. My chest felt tight, though I couldn't explain why. This should have been simple. A broken car, a quick fix, a payment, and closure. Instead, it felt like a door had been left open, one I didn't know how to close. Back in the car, I couldn't stop replaying the moment. His face, his words, the quiet certainty with which he refused what most would have considered a miracle. My driver said something about how lucky we were that he had passed by, how unusual it was to find someone so skilled in the middle of nowhere. I nodded absently, but my mind wasn't on the repair. It was on the refusal. The city lights blurred past the window as we drove, but I barely saw them. All I could hear was his voice. I don't help for money. That night, I lay in bed beneath the glow of the skyline, my sheets crisp and untouched by comfort. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the exchange over and over, unable to let it go. Why had he said no? Why had he walked away from what others would have considered salvation? It wasn't pride. I had seen enough arrogance in my life to recognize it. It wasn't ignorance either. His eyes had been too sharp, too aware. No, his refusal came from something else, something deeper, something I couldn't name. And for the first time in decades, I realized I wouldn't sleep until I knew. The next morning, I made a decision. I would find him, no matter what it took. His face wouldn't leave my mind. So I went searching. Sleep abandoned me that night, as though it, too, had been repelled by the boy's refusal. I lay awake in my penthouse, the city lights sprawling beyond the glass walls. A kingdom I had conquered yet could not control, the one thought echoing inside me. Every deal I had ever made, every negotiation I had won, every opponent I had silenced, it had all followed the same principle. Everyone wanted something, and I was the one who could provide it. But he had wanted nothing from me, and that impossibility gnawed at me like a puzzle missing its final piece. By morning, my resolve had hardened into determination. I wasn't simply curious anymore. I was compelled. I called Kara, my assistant, into my office. She was used to handling billion-dollar mergers, confidential deals, and discreet inquiries into competitors, but never something as strange as what I asked that morning. Find him, I said. Her pen hovered above her notepad. Find who, ma'am? The boy who fixed my car, I replied, my tone sharper than intended. 16, maybe 17. Worn clothes, carried a tool bag. He walked away after refusing payment. I need to know who he is. Kara's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't question me. Years of working by my side had taught her not to ask why, only how. I'll start with local records, she said, and slipped out of the office with the kind of efficiency I had come to depend on. By noon, she returned with information that made my chest tighten in ways I hadn't expected. His name was Daniel. He was the son of a janitor employed in one of my company's office buildings downtown. His father had been with us for nearly 10 years, invisible to the executives who passed him in polished hallways, acknowledged only when something needed to be cleaned or repaired. Kara laid out what little else she had discovered. Daniel was known in his neighborhood for being the boy who fixed things. Bicycles, leaky faucets, broken radios. He helped anyone who asked, never charging, never expecting anything in return. People say he's always been that way, Kara explained. Since his mother passed, he's taken on more responsibilities at home. He helps his father after shifts, takes care of his younger siblings. Apparently, he refuses payment for everything, says kindness isn't supposed to cost money. Her words sank into me like lead. Kindness without cost. How foreign that sounded in the language of my life, where every gesture carried a price, where every favor was an investment, expecting return. And yet here was a boy who defied all of it, who lived by a principle I couldn't buy, couldn't bend, couldn't negotiate away. I sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the file Kara had placed on my desk. His world was so different from mine it might as well have been another planet. No glittering towers, no gala dinners, no power games played over crystal glasses. Just a small apartment, a father cleaning floors for a living, and a boy who repaired broken things not for profit but because he could. "Do you want me to stop here?" Kara asked carefully, sensing my unease. I shook my head. "No, I want more. Where does he live? Who does he spend time with? I want to know everything." Her eyes flickered with hesitation. But again, she didn't argue. She only nodded and left, returning hours later with an address. A modest neighborhood, blocks away from where my company's employees parked their cars before walking into the skyscrapers I owned. I had driven past it hundreds of times without once noticing the lives inside it. I picked up the paper, the ink still fresh, and felt an unfamiliar weight in my chest. This wasn't business. This wasn't strategy. This was something raw, something personal, something I couldn't explain even to myself. That night, as I stood by the window of my penthouse, the city sprawling beneath me like an empire of glass and steel, I realized I was no longer looking down at the skyline with pride. I was staring past it, toward a neighborhood I had ignored my entire life, a place where a boy had refused me, not with arrogance, but with quiet dignity. A boy who seemed to carry more strength in his refusal than I had ever carried in all my victories. And in that moment, I made a decision. I would meet him again. Not as the CEO in her tailored suit. Not as the woman who had built an empire from ambition and distance, but as someone who, for the first time in her life, needed to understand what it meant when someone said, "I don't help for money." The next morning, I stepped into my car with his address in hand, ready to knock on the door of a life I had never known. I thought I was successful until I saw how little they lived with and how much love they had. The address Kara had given me led to a neighborhood I had never once considered entering, even though it was only a short drive from the skyscrapers that bore my company's name. The streets narrowed as we moved deeper, trading polished storefronts and sleek glass facades for brick buildings streaked with age, laundry lines strung between windows, and children playing with makeshift toys in the alleys. My driver slowed as though uncertain whether we belonged here, and I realized that for all the power I wielded across cities, I had been blind to the lives that unfolded just beneath its shining surface. When the car stopped, I stepped out, my heels clicking awkwardly against cracked pavement. The building before me was small, worn, and unremarkable, a place I might have once walked past without a second glance. Yet today, it felt like a threshold into another world. I took a breath, smoothed my coat, and climbed the narrow stairwell, each creak of wood reminding me how fragile this structure was compared to the fortified towers I called my domain. The door opened before I could knock. Daniel stood there, his eyes widening in recognition. For a fleeting second, I thought he might close it again, but instead he stepped back silently, allowing me to enter. The room inside was modest to the point of austerity. A sagging couch pressed against one wall, its fabric patched in places where springs had worn through. The wallpaper peeled in corners, exposing the plaster beneath, and the single light above flickered with uneven resolve. And yet, the air carried warmth, not the sterile warmth of climate control, but the living warmth of a family bound together by something deeper than possessions. 2 younger children sat on the floor, building towers out of mismatched blocks and giggling when they toppled over. The sound startled me, not because it was loud, but because it was pure. Laughter like that had been absent from my home for as long as I could remember. A third child, perhaps 10, raced across the room to Daniel, tugging at his sleeve to show him a drawing held in crayon-stained fingers. He crouched to admire it, nodding with exaggerated approval that made the younger boy beam with pride. I watched, transfixed. He wasn't just an older brother. He was a caretaker, a guide, a constant presence in their fragile universe. Every small gesture, the way he adjusted a toy so it wouldn't fall, the way he handed out pieces of bread from a shared plate, the way his eyes softened when one of them climbed into his lap, spoke of a responsibility far beyond his years. Then, from the corner of the room, movement caught my eye. A man in faded work clothes emerged, his shoulders sloping with the exhaustion of someone who had labored too long for too little. His hands were calloused, his shirt stained from hours of cleaning floors in offices that sparkled for people like me. Yet when his gaze fell upon his children, something remarkable happened. His tired face broke into a smile. Not forced, not polite, but real. "This is my father," Daniel said simply, his voice carrying neither shame nor pride, only fact. The man extended a hand, rough but steady. I shook it, acutely aware of how my own grip, practiced and professional, suddenly felt inadequate in the presence of this quiet resilience. They invited me to sit. The couch sagged under my weight, but the children clustered around me with curiosity that felt disarming rather than invasive. One of them offered me a chipped toy car, another shyly pressed a crumpled drawing into my hand. I looked down at the uneven lines of houses and stick figures, and felt something unexpected stir in my chest. Success, I realized, had never once given me a gift so unguarded. As the evening unfolded, I observed more than I spoke. They had little, very little, but what they had, they shared without hesitation. A single plate of food was divided evenly, no one complaining about portions. The younger ones leaned against Daniel as though he were both brother and parent, and when their father sighed heavily, Daniel wordlessly picked up the chores, sweeping, tidying, filling in the spaces where adulthood had already demanded too much of a boy his age. I thought of my own childhood then, of the silence in my home, the cold dinners eaten in separate rooms, the love withheld as though it were a prize to be earned. I had grown up believing that affection was conditional, that family was transactional. But here, in this dimly lit room with cracked walls and fraying curtains, I saw something I had never truly known. Connection without condition. They had nothing, and yet they had each other. And that, somehow, made them richer than I had ever been. But as I absorbed the scene, my gaze wandered to the walls, searching unconsciously for something missing. Family photographs, framed memories, even small tokens of a mother's presence. There were none. The children's laughter filled the room. The father's weary smile anchored it. Daniel's steady hands held it, together. But there was an absence that grew louder the longer I sat there. Finally, I asked the question that had been circling in my mind since I stepped inside. "Where's your mother?" The room shifted subtly. The children grew quiet, their eyes flickering toward Daniel. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his gaze falling to the floor. The father cleared his throat, the smile fading into something heavier, more fragile. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding, until I realized I had touched upon something not just painful, but defining. And in that moment, I understood. Her absence wasn't temporary, it was permanent. He wasn't just refusing money, he was carrying something much heavier. The silence in that small room pressed against me like a weight I could not shift. The father's eyes clouded with something deeper than fatigue, and the younger children leaned unconsciously into Daniel's side, as though bracing themselves against a storm they had weathered before. My question hung in the air, unanswered, until Daniel finally lifted his gaze to mine. His voice, when it came, was calm, but stripped of innocence. "She's gone." 2 words. Simple, unadorned, yet heavy with finality. My throat tightened. The father shifted, rubbing his temple as though the truth was still too raw to articulate. "My wife passed a little over a year ago," he said quietly. "Illness we couldn't afford to fight. The hospital bills? They were more than I could manage. By the time we realized how bad it was already too late." He spoke without bitterness, but the air trembled with loss. The children remained silent, their wide eyes betraying an understanding far too advanced for their age. And Daniel didn't flinch, didn't soften, didn't even blink. He stood as though he had already absorbed the grief for all of them, as though by holding it himself, he could spare the others. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time I understood why his refusal of money had unsettled me so much. It wasn't pride. It wasn't ignorance. It was the quiet strength of someone who had been forced into adulthood too soon, someone who had decided that dignity mattered more than pity. He wasn't just a boy fixing cars for strangers. He was a child holding together an entire family with hands that should have been free to build his own dreams. The father's voice faltered as he continued. "Since then, Daniel has taken on more than he should. He helps me after shifts, looks after the little ones, makes sure they eat before he does. He thinks it's his duty now to be the man of the house." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't even glance at me for sympathy. Instead, he bent to pick up a toy one of the children had dropped and returned it with a small smile, as if that simple act mattered more than the conversation unfolding around him. His resilience was staggering, not loud or performative, but steady, like the walls of a house refusing to collapse no matter how fierce the storm. I felt something inside me shift uncomfortably. All my life, I had equated strength with domination, with conquering opponents, silencing critics, expanding empires. Yet here was a boy whose strength lay in endurance, in sacrifice, in the refusal to bend under the crushing weight of responsibility. His power didn't come from titles or wealth. It came from love. I couldn't just leave it there. I couldn't walk away knowing what he carried on his young shoulders. My instinct, my training, was to fix things with resources, with access, with opportunities. So I leaned forward, my voice gentler now, almost careful. "Daniel, you're remarkable, but you shouldn't have to do this alone. You're smart, capable. If you had the right education, the right support, you could build a future for yourself. I could help. I could offer you a scholarship, pay for your schooling, open doors most people never even see." The father looked at me with gratitude flooding his tired eyes, but Daniel's reaction was different. He stood still, his expression calm but unreadable. Slowly, he shook his head. "I can't," he said simply. I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean you can't?" He met my gaze directly, his eyes unwavering. "If I leave, who takes care of them? Who makes sure they're fed? Who helps my father when he's too tired to stand? My place is here." The words struck harder than I wanted to admit. I opened my mouth to argue, to explain that his family would benefit more if he accepted my help, that with the right education he could change all their lives. But the conviction in his face silenced me. This wasn't the refusal of a stubborn child. It was the decision of someone who had already sacrificed his own dreams for the sake of others. For the second time, he had rejected what I thought was salvation. And for the second time, I found myself shaken, not by the refusal itself, but by the clarity with which he made it. I had given him the key to a different future. But he turned it down without hesitation, leaving me desperate to understand why. No one had ever said no to me twice, and it broke me. I had built an empire on the certainty that everything and everyone could be persuaded, that every refusal was simply a negotiation waiting for the right angle, the right price, the right leverage. In boardrooms across the world, People folded under the weight of my offers because I never presented one without making sure it was irresistible. Yet this boy, standing in a crumbling apartment with worn shoes and the weight of a family on his back, had done what billionaires, competitors, and even lifelong adversaries could not. He told me no, not once, but twice. And he hadn't done it with arrogance or hostility. He had done it with quiet conviction, with a steadiness that unsettled me more than open defiance ever could. As I sat in my car afterward, the city lights flashing by in blurred streaks, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in years. Doubt. Why wasn't my money enough? Why didn't my opportunities matter to him the way they mattered to everyone else? How could he look at the golden door I had opened and walk away as though it led nowhere? The questions gnawed at me long after I reached my apartment. I poured a glass of wine I didn't drink, stared out at the skyline that once filled me with pride, and found only emptiness staring back. For years, I had measured success in acquisitions, in headlines, in the fear and admiration etched into the faces of those who spoke my name. But Daniel's refusal had shaken the foundation of those measures. What good was my wealth if it couldn't change the life of a boy who deserved more than struggle? What power did I really have if it couldn't shift the one thing that mattered most to him? And in that space of silence, memories I had buried long ago rose unbidden. I saw myself as a child, sitting in a vast dining room at a table too large for 2 people, while my parents discussed numbers, business deals, and investments as though I weren't even there. I remembered sliding my report card across the polished wood one evening, my heart fluttering with pride, waiting for acknowledgement that never came. My father glanced at it once, murmured something about adequate, and returned to his papers. My mother didn't even look. The warmth I craved was replaced with lectures about the importance of self-reliance, about how emotions were a liability in a world built on profit. That was the night I decided love was not guaranteed, but success could be. If affection could be denied, then money would never fail me. If approval could vanish, then power would remain. I shaped my entire existence around that lesson, hardening myself until nothing could pierce the armor I had built. And it had worked. Or so I thought. Until Daniel. Because in his rejection of everything I offered, I heard an echo of the child I had once been, the one who had begged silently for love and been handed silence in return. He wasn't refusing me because he didn't value what I had. He was refusing me because he valued something more, something I had never been given and had long ago stopped seeking. Kindness, connection, love that didn't come with conditions or contracts. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, turning over the truth I had been running from. My life was filled with possessions but empty of meaning. My calendar was crowded with meetings but void of relationships. My empire was vast, yet when stripped bare, it was only me, alone, untouchable, and unbearably hollow. Daniel had less than I could imagine surviving on, yet he carried himself with a richness I couldn't replicate, no matter how many billions were in my accounts. The thought unsettled me more than any hostile takeover or financial collapse ever had. Because for the first time, I wasn't fighting to protect my company. I was fighting to understand my own soul. The next morning, I looked in the mirror as I dressed and saw not the sharp, polished woman who commanded rooms, but someone suddenly unsure of what her power meant. The reflection felt fragile, as though the mask I had worn for decades was finally cracking. I knew then that simply writing checks or making grand offers wouldn't bridge the chasm between Daniel's world and mine. If I wanted to understand him, to truly grasp the strength that guided his choices, I would have to step into his life, not as a benefactor, not as a savior, but as a witness. And so, for the first time in years, I cleared my schedule not for investors or politicians, but for something far more radical. I decided I would spend more time with Daniel's family, and in doing so, I would risk unraveling everything I thought I knew about myself. They taught me more in 1 week than I'd learned in a lifetime of boardrooms. When I first made the decision to spend time with Daniel's family, I believed I knew exactly how it would unfold. In my world, problems were solved with resources, burdens were lifted with money, and gratitude was ensured through generosity. So I did what came naturally to me. I began showing up at their doorstep with groceries, envelopes slipped discreetly to cover their bills, and quiet payments made toward rent so the father would not fall behind. I thought I was easing their suffering, that they would welcome the relief without hesitation. It was, after all, the way the world worked in my experience. You give, they take, and the transaction leaves both sides satisfied. But Daniel saw through it almost immediately. One evening, as I placed a bag of fresh food on the counter, he stood quietly watching me, his arms folded across his chest. He waited until his siblings had scampered off with excitement at the fruit and bread before he spoke. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. I smiled, brushing off his words. "Of course I do. You shouldn't have to worry about these things. You've carried too much already. Let me carry some of it for you." His eyes didn't soften. Instead, they held me in place with a steadiness that made me feel as though I were the child, not him. "Don't try to buy us," he said quietly. "Just sit with us." The simplicity of his request stopped me cold. I had expected gratitude, perhaps even relief. What I had not expected was rejection, not of the money this time, but of the pattern it represented. He wasn't asking for my resources. He was asking for my presence, and that, I realized, was something I had rarely given anyone. So, hesitantly, I did as he asked. I stayed. I sat at the table with them as his younger siblings laughed and argued over who got the bigger slice of bread. His father returned home late that evening, his shirt damp with sweat, and instead of being served in silence as I had known in my childhood, he was greeted with cheers and stories. They told him everything: the spilled cup of water, the broken toy, the funny thing Daniel had said while helping with homework, and he listened as though each detail was the most important story in the world. Then Daniel placed a plate in front of me. The food was simple: beans, rice, a few vegetables, but it was offered with such unguarded generosity that I felt my throat tighten. I took a bite, and though the taste was ordinary, the experience was extraordinary. For the first time in my life, a meal wasn't about presentation or power. It wasn't about impressing investors or outshining competitors. It was about being together, about nourishment that extended beyond the body and into the heart. I watched as the children leaned into one another, as laughter spilled across the table like light, as their father ruffled Daniel's hair with pride. And for the first time, I understood what connection truly felt like. Not the carefully curated connections of networking events, not the conditional alliances of business, but the raw, unpolished, irreplaceable bond of family. Over the days that followed, I found myself returning again and again. Sometimes I brought nothing but myself. Sometimes I carried small things, a loaf of bread, a book for the children. But always, I stayed. I learned to listen to their stories, to laugh at their jokes, to help wash dishes in a sink that leaked at the corner. I learned that humility wasn't the absence of strength. It was the presence of humanity. And somewhere in that cramped apartment, surrounded by chipped plates and mismatched chairs, I felt something I hadn't known I was missing: belonging. But as my heart softened, the world I had built outside those walls began to grow suspicious. My assistant, Kara, cornered me one afternoon in my office, her face pale with unease. She closed the door behind her before speaking in a low voice. "They're talking," she whispered. I frowned. "Who's talking?" "The board. The investors. People have noticed your absences. They're saying you're distracted, that your priorities are shifting." Her words landed like a thunderclap, dragging me back into the reality I had almost forgotten. My empire, my reputation, my carefully maintained image, everything was beginning to fracture under the weight of this new life I had allowed myself to touch. And in that moment, I realized I was standing on a knife's edge, between the empire I had built and the family that was teaching me how to live. My empire demanded one thing. His family demanded another. It began quietly, the way cracks always do, small enough to ignore at first, until they spread so far that denial becomes impossible. At first, it was only whispers among the assistants and advisors who noticed that my calendar no longer revolved entirely around shareholders, mergers, and international calls. I was taking afternoons off without explanation. Meetings that would once have been immovable were suddenly rescheduled, sometimes even canceled outright. For the first time in years, I was saying no to opportunities, and the people who had built their livelihoods around my predictability began to wonder what had changed. Then the media caught wind. A woman like me couldn't sneeze without it making headlines, and now reporters had spotted me in a part of the city I had never before acknowledged. Photographs appeared in glossy magazines and online tabloids. The powerful CEO in a neighborhood of peeling paint and cracked sidewalks. They speculated wildly. Was it a scandal? A secret deal? A hidden charity project? The headlines were merciless. Steel Queen goes. Soft? Billionaire in the slums. What is she hiding? Has she lost her edge? Each article chipped away at the armor I had spent years perfecting. Investors began to call, their voices tinged with anxiety. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about perception, and perception was everything in the volatile markets we ruled. "You've worked too hard to let sentimentality cloud your judgment," one of them warned. "Focus, or you'll lose control." Then came the board. They were men and women who had once bowed to my decisions without hesitation, but now they saw vulnerability where before they had seen only strength. In a meeting that stretched late into the night, they confronted me directly. "Your recent activities are distracting," one member said pointedly. "This company cannot afford a leader whose priorities are divided." The implication was clear. Choose your empire, or risk losing it. I sat in that boardroom, surrounded by sleek suits and cold eyes, and for the first time, their words did not pierce me as they once would have. Instead, they echoed hollow, like voices in a cavern too large to matter. Because even as they spoke of markets and margins, my mind was not in that room. It was in a cramped apartment where laughter spilled over chipped plates, where love was measured not in dividends but in care. It was with a boy who had refused me twice, not to humiliate me, but to remind me that dignity was worth more than any fortune. I was torn cleanly in two. One half of me was the woman I had always been, the strategist, the conqueror, the CEO, whose name was synonymous with power. The other half was someone I barely recognized, someone who found herself leaning into warmth, learning humility at a table where nothing matched except the hearts gathered around it. The board demanded my empire. His family demanded my humanity. And for the first time, I didn't know which side I belonged to. The pressure mounted until even Kara, my loyal assistant, began urging me to reconsider. "You've worked for this your entire life," she whispered one evening as she handed me documents I hadn't touched all day. "Don't throw it away. Not for something you can't even explain." Her words were laced with genuine concern, but I could see in her eyes that she no longer understood me. Perhaps no one in my world ever truly had. And then, just when I thought the weight of this impossible choice might crush me, the decision was ripped from my hands in the most brutal way imaginable. It was a Thursday morning when the call came. Daniel had collapsed at school. The principal's voice on the other end of the line was trembling. He fainted in class. Exhaustion, we think. He's been pushing himself too hard. The ambulance is on its way. For a moment, the world tilted. The boardroom battles, the investors' warnings, the headlines, they all evaporated into nothingness. All I could see was his face, pale and steady, saying, "I don't help for money." All I could hear was the echo of his quiet refusals, the strength that had carried his family until his own body could no longer bear it. And in that moment, I realized, this wasn't just about choosing between my empire and his family anymore. It was about whether I could save him before it was too late. I'd bought hospitals before, but never cared who was inside one until then. The ambulance's siren echoed in my ears long after I arrived, as though the sound had lodged itself deep in my chest, refusing to quiet. I had rushed through corridors polished to a sterile shine, corridors I had walked before but never like this. In the past, my steps through hospitals had been those of an investor, a donor, a woman whose signature could fund new wings or cut ribbons at grand openings. The patients inside had been invisible to me. Names on charts, numbers on reports, symbols of efficiency or inefficiency. But now it was Daniel lying behind those double doors, and suddenly every sterile light felt harsh, every second stretched unbearably long. When they finally allowed me into the room, I almost didn't recognize him. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, his body far too thin beneath the stiff white sheets. Machines beeped softly around him, their rhythm the only reassurance that he was still here, still fighting. I sat in the chair by his bed, my heart pounding in a way I had never experienced in the fiercest boardroom battles. Deals could be renegotiated, markets could recover, empires could be rebuilt. But here, in this room, there was no strategy, no leverage, no second chance if the outcome tilted the wrong way. The doctors filed in, their expressions carefully neutral. I braced myself as one of them. A man with graying hair and kind but weary eyes explained. He's suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. His body has been running on empty for too long. He needs rest, proper meals, stability. I frowned, my mind unable to reconcile the words. Malnutrition? But I've seen him eat. I've watched him sit at the table with his siblings. The doctor sighed, lowering his voice as though afraid of the truth itself. Yes, but what you didn't see is that he makes sure his siblings eat first. He skips meals, gives up his portions. Children like him. They carry burdens far too heavy for their age. And eventually, the body breaks down. The weight of his words slammed into me, leaving me breathless. All those times he had smiled quietly, refusing money, declining opportunities. I had mistaken it for pride, for stubbornness. But it wasn't pride at all. It was survival. Every refusal had been a shield, not for himself, but for the family he protected with every ounce of his being. He hadn't been rejecting me. He had been protecting them. I looked back at him, lying motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, and something inside me cracked wide, open. I had faced hostile takeovers, betrayals from partners, even the collapse of entire markets, but never had I felt this helpless. My hands, once so skilled at signing contracts worth billions, trembled uselessly in my lap. What use was all my wealth, all my power, if a boy was starving himself under my nose and I hadn't seen it until he collapsed? I stayed by his side as the hours bled into night. Nurses came and went, adjusting tubes, checking vitals, but I didn't move. My phone buzzed endlessly with missed calls, board members, investors, reporters, but I silenced it all. For the first time in my life, the empire could wait. This boy could not. I held his hand, small and calloused, and whispered words I wasn't sure he could hear. You don't have to carry it all alone anymore. Do you hear me? You don't. The longer I sat there, the more the truth clawed at me. My wealth could pay every hospital bill, could stock their kitchen with food for years, could clothe and shelter them better than they had ever known. But it couldn't erase the pain he had endured, the nights he had gone hungry, the sacrifices that had carved away his childhood. And I, in all my blindness, had tried to solve it with offers he could never accept, because his refusal wasn't arrogance. It was desperation dressed as dignity. By dawn, I found myself breaking. the walls I had built for decades. Walls that had kept me strong, distant, unshakable, crumbled under the weight of his fragility. Tears blurred my vision, spilling unchecked as I pressed my forehead to the back of his hand. "I thought you were teaching me about pride," I whispered, "but all this time, you were teaching me about survival." And in that moment, I realized the lesson wasn't his to learn, it was mine. In that hospital room, I realized I wasn't saving him, he was saving me. The hours blurred into one another as I sat by Daniel's bedside, the sterile beeping of machines keeping rhythm with my heartbeat. His face, pale and still, seemed impossibly young, and yet the weight of all he carried had etched lines of quiet determination across it. I had never waited so helplessly before. In my world, action was power, decisions were control, and outcomes bent to the strength of will. But here, there was nothing to sign, nothing to negotiate, nothing to command. All I could do was sit and hope. And then, sometime after midnight, he stirred. His eyelids fluttered, his lips moved faintly, and for a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then his voice, raspy and weak, broke through the silence. "You can't buy respect," he whispered. "You can only earn it." The words pierced me deeper than any confrontation in a boardroom ever had. I leaned closer, tears blurring my vision. "Daniel?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why would you say that now?" His gaze found mine, tired yet unyielding. "Because you've been trying to buy everything. But respect, love, family, you can't buy those. You have to live them," I froze, struck by the unbearable truth of it. My entire life, I had chased respect through fear, admiration through power, connection through money. I had believed that success was the only language worth speaking, and that everything else could be acquired if I just offered the right price. And yet, lying weak in that hospital bed, a boy who had given up his meals for his siblings, who had rejected every offer I thought was salvation, was teaching me that the very foundation of my life was flawed. I felt my defenses crumble piece by piece. For the first time, I admitted what I had never dared. I had been living wrong. All my victories, all my accolades, all the wealth that glittered so brightly around me, it was hollow, because respect born from fear was not respect at all. Love exchanged for comfort was not love, and success without meaning was nothing more than gilded emptiness. I took his hand, fragile in mine, and spoke words I never thought would leave my lips. "You're right. I've been wrong. All this time. I thought I was here to save you, but the truth is, you're the one saving me." My voice cracked, raw with sincerity. "I promise you this. I will honor your values. I won't try to buy what should never be bought. I'll learn. I'll change." For a moment, silence stretched between us, broken only by the steady rhythm of the monitor. Then he closed his eyes again, exhaustion pulling him back to rest. But his words remained, etched into me more deeply than any deal, any contract, any speech I had ever given. I stayed until morning, watching the city awaken outside the hospital window, and felt a clarity I had never known. For the first time, the empire I had built seemed less like a crown and more like a cage. I understood now that the life I had worshipped had been built on illusions, and if I continued, I would lose not only Daniel, but also the chance to reclaim the humanity I had abandoned. But clarity came with cost, because even as I sat there, the messages from the board piled up. They were demanding an emergency meeting. The media storm was worsening. Investors were threatening to pull out. The empire I had spent decades building was buckling under the weight of my absence, and the vultures were circling. By the time I returned to my office, the air was thick with tension. Kara met me at the door, her face pale, her voice urgent. "They're waiting for you. They want answers. They won't accept delays anymore." I stood in the hallway outside the boardroom, the polished mahogany doors looming before me. Behind them sat men and women who had followed me for years, who had believed in me, who now questioned whether I was still the leader they needed. Inside that room, I would be forced to make a choice between the empire that had defined me and the family that was teaching me how to live. And as I placed my hand on the door, knew this decision would change everything forever. I gave up everything I thought I needed for the one thing I never had. The boardroom was silent after I finished speaking, but it was the kind of silence that vibrated with disbelief. For the first time in my career, I didn't argue, didn't persuade, didn't fight for my seat at the head of the table. I simply told them the truth, that I was stepping down. A murmur rippled through the room, sharp with shock and outrage. Some thought it was a tactic, a power move to rattle them. Others whispered about weakness, instability, even betrayal. For years, I had been the unshakable cornerstone of this empire, the name investors trusted, the face that reassured markets. And now, I was walking away. The press descended like vultures before the ink was dry on the official statement. Headlines screamed across front pages, "CEO loses grip on reality." From boardroom queen to broken woman. Is this the end of an empire? They dissected every aspect of my life, every public appearance, every unexplained visit to Daniel's neighborhood, painting a picture of a woman unraveling. But for the first time, I didn't care. The noise that once defined my worth no longer touched me. I walked out of that skyscraper with the weight of the world lifted from my shoulders, breathing air that felt real for the first time in decades. I had traded the illusion of power for something far greater: freedom. In the days that followed, I began to redirect my wealth, not into acquisitions or stock portfolios, but into lives. I created a scholarship fund in Daniel's name, quietly at first, then more boldly as the vision grew. It wasn't just about him. It was about children like him, children whose brilliance and resilience were buried beneath poverty, who deserved a chance to rise without being forced to sacrifice everything for survival. I met with schools, teachers, and community leaders. For the first time, my meetings weren't about extracting value, but about giving it. Every conversation left me lighter. Every decision carried meaning I had never felt in all the years of expanding my empire. And slowly, the headlines shifted. Some still called me reckless. Some still branded me unstable. But others began to see the pattern: an empire being rebuilt, not on profit, but on people. Yet through it all, Daniel remained the center of my thoughts. I visited him often as he recovered, watching the color return to his cheeks, the strength slowly fill his frame again. His siblings clung to him with renewed joy. His father's gratitude was endless, but Daniel himself remained steady, unchanged. He accepted my presence, but not my interference. He listened, but he did not bend. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped low over the city and painted the walls of their small apartment with gold, he finally spoke. I had been telling him about the scholarship fund, about the doors it was opening, about the children whose lives were already beginning to change. I turned to him, my heart aching with the same question I had carried since the night we met. "Daniel," I asked softly, "will you accept my offer now? Will you take the scholarship for yourself?" He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, his silence thick with meaning. Then, finally, he nodded. "Yes," he said, "but only on one condition." And in that moment, I realized his condition would change everything. For him, for me, and for the legacy I was building. If this story touched your heart, imagine the lessons hidden in the next one. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in her place? Don't forget to like the video if you believe kindness is stronger than money. Subscribe and join our journey for more powerful stories that change the way we see life.